Shalom and welcome to the One Pusik podcast, in which three rabbis from Englewood, New Jersey, each share an insight on one particular pusik from the Parsha and reflect on each other's ideas. Rabbinic banter, I like to call it. I am Rabbi Chaim Pupko of Congregation Avat Torah, and I'm joined by my dear friends and colleagues,
Rabbi Akiva Block, Kihilat Kesher,
and Rabbi Daniel Goldberg, Eitz Chaim, the Englewood Stiebel.
Two housekeeping items before we begin. First, to sponsor an episode of the One Pusik podcast, visit onepusikpodcast.com and click on the sponsorship link. Of course, we'll announce your dedication at the beginning of the episode and hopefully enhance the celebration of an occasion or honor the yortzeit of a loved one with Torah in their merit. And second, please take a moment and give us a 5-star rating on your podcast platform. I've never made this pitch before, but it seems that you can't be a real podcast without it. More importantly, the more positive ratings we get, the more this podcast will show up in searches. And so just by clicking 5 stars, you are fulfilling the mitzvah to be Marbitz Torah, to spread and increase the learning of Torah. Okay, our one pasuk this week for Parshas Shemos, which can be found in chapter 1, verse 10, Perek Aleph, pasuk Yud, Hava nischakma lo pen yirbeh. Paro declares, "Come, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply. V'haya ki sikrena milchama v'nosaf gam hu al sonenu, v'nilcham banu ve'Allah min haaretz." Lest they multiply and it come to pass that when any war should chance, they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so go up out of the land. In this well-known pasuk, which appears in the Pesach Haggadah as well, of course, we have a succinct encapsulation of how Bnei Yisrael went from honored guests in Egypt to a despised, enslaved minority. And it's interesting, before we dive into the pasuk itself, I was thinking about the fact that I chose this pasuk because much ink has been spilled on this pasuk. But as I was preparing it for myself, I realized that it's the most often cited pasuk for a particular topic, for the topic of anti-Semitism.
Anti-Semitism.
Exactly. That Paro's thinking is seen by many as an antecedent or a formula for how anti-Semitic thinking develops, what drives such hatred, how it becomes executed or acted upon. I'm curious, do you guys find yourselves speaking from the pulpit about anti-Semitism more? I naturally just find myself just gravitating towards this topic for obvious reasons. And I ask myself, am I speaking too much about it? Is it on people's minds? Do you guys speak about anti-Semitism? Do you do it consciously? Would you rather speak about something else?
I try to make it that I never give a drasha only about anti-Semitism. Sometimes it might be part of a larger discussion.
Why not?
I just feel like it's not the vision of Judaism. I think it's my responsibility, my obligation to offer the Torah perspective on whatever topic I'm talking about. I think that if we think about what the mission and purpose of a Jew or a Jewish community in this world is today, that mission is not to fight anti-Semitism. It's so much deeper, so much broader, so much richer than that. And our identity, our way of life, our commitment, our faith can't be based just on the fact that there are people who hate us. It might be an ingredient, might be a piece, but it's certainly not just that. So I do think it's on people's minds, and I'd be remiss if I never spoke about it. I think it's important to speak to people's fears and their insecurities and reassure them and give them a sense of hope. And I do try to do that. For that reason, I was a little bit disappointed. Not disappointed, that's not the right word. But I almost sighed a little bit when I saw that this was the pasuk that you chose, because who really wants to talk about anti-Semitism? But so
that's the thing. I wasn't even thinking about it when I chose the pasuk. I was just thinking about the fact that it's a popular pasuk. That's it.
I took it upon myself, as you'll see, to find a thought in the pasuk that's not about anti-Semitism. But I do recognize that this is something that's on people's minds. And
sometime after October 7th, I don't remember when, I remember reading an article of somebody arguing that if you look at how much money, how many donations have been made to organizations that are combating anti-Semitism, and what's the return on investment? Very little. And that this article is arguing that to shift our focus, shift our priorities towards education and community building,
There's a
as
lot
opposed to combating anti-Semitism, because it's just going to be there always.
Yeah, listen, I think we don't have the alternate history, so we couldn't see where we would be if no one was fighting these fights. And though
That's true.
it's not where I think my energy is best placed. I think there are people who are really committed to fighting the fight, and a lot of these fights happen on very small scales, writing campaigns to Netflix for airing this particularly offensive movie or to this institution, whatever the case may be. And I think that there is work that is done and achieved and accomplishes a lot on a small scale. But I think, like many things that we undertake, it's an imperfect and not only partially successful, but those partial successes, I think, are still worthy.
You make an excellent point. I was listening to a podcast recently. I forget if it was Dan Senor or Chavi Rettigur, but it was definitely one of those. And he had on someone who was talking about Wikipedia and the fight that's going on Wikipedia right now, and how there is such a robust, coordinated effort to manipulate the articles about Israel and the war to be just blatantly anti-Israel, like no objectivity whatsoever. It goes totally against the whole vision and concept of what Wikipedia is supposed to be. And this guy was talking about all the coordinated, very sophisticated efforts that go into it and how we're just outnumbered.
Yeah.
We don't have the manpower to fight this fight. And it's important.
Yeah.
Wikipedia article about Israel is important.
Yeah. It reminds me of a very, very sharp line that I heard. I forgot exactly where it was, but it was someone reflecting on his experience in the Soviet Union. And he said, the future is certain. It's the past that keeps changing. And I think that there's something very profound about that.
Yeah.
So it's a fight over it's a fight over Wikipedia, right? It's like, we're all destined for some grand future, but the story we tell ourselves about what happened, that's what keeps changing.
It's actually apropos and fitting, because part of what we could talk about the pasuk, but
Segue. Go for it.
Segue. We need segue music. Segue.
So much of what happened in Mitzrayim happened because the Egyptians created this narrative about the Jewish people that was just it was an alternate reality from what Yosef and his family actually meant and who they were, and the past just changed. There was no ability to hold on to that past in an authentic and genuine way.
Beautiful segue. And I'm going to take up that segue because I now know that you are not going to be discussing the anti-Semitic dimension of this pasuk in as much as is a kind of a blueprint. So I'll just jump in. The Rashi says when Paro is describing his anxieties about what the Jewish people are going to do, real or just a kind of a guise, whatever the case may be, he says that they might come join up with our enemies, ve'Allah min ha'aretz, they'll go up from the land. And Rashi, in his second comment on this pasuk, after the Dibra Maskal ve'Allah min ha'aretz, so he cites a Gemara in Sota that says that really Paro was concerned that Ali knew they're going to drive us out of the land, whether it's the people generally or whether it was his administration, his leadership, that they're going to be driven out of the land. But it says, Ke'adam shemekalel atzmo v'tola kilalaso ba'achirim. It's like a person who is talking about something bad and negative about himself, but pins it on someone else because doesn't even want to articulate that this is possibly his destiny. So he puts it on them, but it's really self-reflective. So that's the simple reading of that Gemara. But there's another dimension to this Gemara, to this line that I think is so telling about anti-Semitism generally, and that is Ke'adam shemekal atzmo v'tolek kilaso ba'achirim. You pin the negative things on the Jewish people. You pin society's worst fears on the Jewish people, but it's really a self-inflicted wound. You're really cursing yourself. And whenever we have seen this pattern play itself out in all of its different guises, right? We know the language, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs would describe it as a virus that morphs and mutates over history, but it's always ultimately, in all of its different guises, a self-inflicted wound. And what societies do to themselves by way of anti-Semitism, whether it's because they end up losing productive dimension of their society, the Jewish population, or just the destruction of its own societal ideals by way of anti-Semitism. It is mikal atzmo, you're cursing yourself. And the biggest tragedy for what we're seeing becoming so mainstream in the American discourse and in media and all over the place in America is really what it means for America. It's scary as Jews, but scarier still when you broaden the lens for what America means in the world to free people everywhere and to people everywhere aspiring to live a free life according to their values and freedom writ large. That's really sad because America matters to the whole world. And anti-Semitism becoming mainstream in America is a self-inflicted wound that I hope the country can recover from.
Yeah, I think what you're highlighting, I think one of the best examples is people in this country who tend to use language like liberty and freedom. I'm not making this a right versus left thing, but it's specifically many people who are so focused on personal liberties who are able to somehow suspend that when it comes to Jews, when it comes to Israel, that because of their beliefs of what Israel is doing, these just don't apply to Jews anymore. Because Jews are guilty of whatever they're guilty of, now we can treat them differently. They found that off-ramp from their ideology, a healthy ideology of liberty and freedom for everyone, and they found that off-ramp because now they have their justification.
There's also all the persecution and all the discrimination is always in service of quote unquote preservation. We want to preserve liberty. We want to preserve democracy. And
Right.
that which is standing in front of us is a threat to all of that. And curtailing free speech is always, or any whatever other freedoms, whether it's the freedom to speak the language that you grew up speaking, you got to speak English, right? Or the freedom to live how you want. It's always because these people pose a existential threat, which is also what Paro was saying here. So the thought that I wanted to share isn't totally unrelated to anti-Semitism, but is really about conflict in general. And Paro, almost the slide of the tongue, says here, Pen yirbev haya kitikrena milchama, kitikrena, Paro says here, Pen yirbev haya kitikrena milchama. Milchama means, and if a war will happen, v'nosafgam hu al sonenu, and the Jews will lop on, will find common cause, if you will, with our enemies. It's interesting also.
The fifth column, yeah.
So Paro's not really looking at the Jewish people as an existential threat as much as he is afraid that they will be a nuisance or will find common cause with whoever their real enemy is, which is also, if you look throughout history, so much of anti-Semitism, so much of persecution and violence against Jews has been that. Look at the Crusades. They were on their way to liberate the Holy Land from the infidels, and the Jews were collateral damage. So often Jews have just been collateral damage also. But what's interesting, and I saw a comment of the Chizkuni here, which I found so fascinating, the Chizkuni points out that the verb that's used to refer to war is tikrena, which is a verb in the plural form. Ki tikrena milchama. Not ki tikra milchama, but ki tikrena milchama. When war happens, but war happens in the plural. And the Chizkuni notes that this is not so uncommon. He refers to the verse in Bamidbar, Perek Yud, about the Chatzotros, ki tavo'u milchama ba'artechem. Not ki tavo milchama, tavo'u in the plural. He doesn't explain why war is described in Chumash generally as happening in the plural, but I find that message, that lesson is really so incredibly profound. War is never about one thing, and war is never just one thing. One need only reflect on the experience of the Jewish people over the course of the last few years and see just the tiered, layered experience of wartime. All of the different challenges and all the different problems and all the different tensions and all the different conflicts and also all the different opportunities and all the different benefits, if we can speak of such things, of war really all come to the fore when one experiences like a period of national wartime. Ki tikrena milchama, when all the wars that a war brings happen, all of this is going to happen. And just, of course, the war that Paro is describing and the war that we've just experienced are two completely different things. But just to think about the multi-layered and multi-tiered nature of war, which I think is encapsulated by this plural verb of ki tikrena. If you blink, you miss it, because it's not really a feature of the pasuk. I only noticed it, how many times have I read this pasuk? I only noticed it when I read the Chizkuni, but it's just really so incredibly deep and profound that war brings with it so many different challenges and exposures and experiences, so many tensions, so many conflicts, so many problems, and so many opportunities. And I think we've definitely experienced that over the course of the last couple of years.
I think it beautifully encapsulates the complexities of the last few years, our own experience of how many wars we're fighting and we fought. And not just, we speak about it on different fronts, and you can add all of the Houthis and the Syrians, every single border, you can add to that our home front in America. And then there's also, as you said, there's the war within, which is an inevitability at some point with a protracted war, that there will be fights. And then every single mother home alone with children, as her husband redeploys, on Miluim for the third time, is fighting her own war every single morning to just keep everything afloat and keep broadly society running. And so, I think it captures the nature of war, which we think of as being very singular. And in fact, war is so many different things and so many wars being fought at once.
Yeah.
So one thing I notice about this pasuk is that the last part of the pasuk doesn't seem to make sense, right? If all these fears play out, they will leave the land. Why is this bad? Why is it bad, V'la min haaretz? If we hate them so much, if we think that they are going to join with our enemies, so if they leave, that's better. So the Sforno has a fascinating observation. He comments on the phrase "v'nosaf gam hu al sonenu," that they will join with our enemies. But the Sforno has a little bit of a different reading, and that is "v'nosaf gam hu al sonenu" is they may display their hatred of us, seeing that they have remained culturally distinct. Meaning, the more they stay unique, the more they stay separate, the more they're going to become hostile towards us. And so what he says, he makes reference to the fact that all the way back when the brothers first come down to Egypt and Yosef invites them to stay and eat, so the pasuk talks about how Yosef ate separate from the Egyptians because he couldn't eat with them. And Yosef ate separately from his brothers because they didn't know he was Yosef at the time. And so the Sforno cites that to demonstrate that the Egyptians treated the Jews differently, and they wouldn't even eat with them. And because they treated them as different and distinct, they remained that way, and they therefore continued to be people who are different, people who are strange, people who are alien, and people who are to be feared. And so the Sforno says that Ve'ala min haaretz means that no, because they're different, we should get them to leave. Meaning Ve'ala min haaretz was Paro's intention, not his fear, but rather V'nosaf gam hu al sonenu, they will continue to be different than us, Ve'ala min haaretz, and they should leave the land. That's the lichatchila. Then at some point, Paro changes his mind and says, okay, you know what, let's make their lives miserable, hoping they would leave, but it developed into slavery, and they realized, hey, you know what, we've got this great workforce, why should we let them leave? For me, I think the implicit lesson is that what enabled the hatred and the xenophobia was the fact that they were kept separate, the fact that they wouldn't break bread with them, the fact that they wouldn't eat with them. The best way to combat xenophobia, anti-Semitism, hatred, is to create situations where people meet face to face, right? The most important thing in having different cultures understand each other is for them to sit down and talk face to face. And it's part of one of my favorite Rabbi Sachs books, The Home We Build Together, where he talks about how the clash of civilizations can only be solved if you get people to work together on local community projects, right? You get different people, different cultures that come to the same place and they don't get along, have them make a community garden together, and they start getting to know each other. And once they start getting to know each other, they now feel like they have a shared identity, a shared project.
It's such a complex question here because on the one hand, what you're suggesting is that our kind of parochial, inward-facing posture allowed a certain kind of Jew hatred to run amok, meaning we didn't break bread with them was the issue. Mitzad Sheni, I think we would all agree that the Jews holding on to their particularism was also absolutely essential for their survival, right? Meaning the taboos that we have around food and gvinas akum and bijul akum and all these things and kashrus generally creates a very healthy and helpful cultural divide, which allows us to be ourselves. And I think from a place of strength, once we're truly ourselves and strong in our own identity, you can go out in the world and be that ambassador. But it's a difficult line. I don't know that I would say the prescription for the Jewish people in Egypt was to be more integrated into Egyptian society. I guess I'm pushing back, not fundamentally on your point, but on where's that line of how you guard an identity, but then also go out in the world and break bread and have those conversations and forge those connections.
So that's a great point. It helps me to clarify how I look at it differently, and that is, this is a reality of humanity that people will break down into familiar groups, and this is part of Hashem's plan with the bris, that the Jewish people should represent what I think is a universal idea, and I credit Rabbi Sachs with this idea, that we're like a template or a model for what humanity should be thinking about constantly, which is we're different and we have different cultures, and we have to respect and appreciate different identities and different ways of living. And so it's not about whether they should have been more integrated or should not have been more integrated. No, by definition, as unique people, they're going to be unique. Their identity is going to be unique. And this is the template. This story is the template for the dangers of treating a minority group a different way.
So do you differentiate, though, between being a minority in Egypt versus coming from a place of strength? Like, let's say, if you're living in Israel or maybe here in Englewood, vis-a-vis our neighbors here. I don't know. To me, I feel like there's a bright line kind of difference there.
Do you look at our lives in Egypt as not coming from a position of strength? Their grandfather was the viceroy.
Yeah, once upon a time, but how long can you cash those checks?
But that's the point. I think the point is that they lived an isolated life, and they were only able to cash those checks for a limited period of time because there was no strengthening, there was no cultivation, there was no developing of that relationship.
I guess just zooming out a little bit, maybe where I think a helpful kind of encapsulation of what I'm offering in addition to what you're saying is, I think the greatest expression of Jewish integration into the world and playing a role in broader society is actually the Beis HaMikdash in the times of Shlomo HaMelech, when the Jewish people were at our strongest. And when we're fixed on the land and we have the Beis HaMikdash and we have all the tools in our tool belt, that's the time when the nations of the world can flow to the Beis HaMikdash and we can view ourselves as being these ambassadors. So the stronger we are, the more we can lean into that. And the more we are at the whims of broader society and the more that we feel vulnerable, I guess the more it both makes sense, and our natural intuition is to be parochial and turn inward. And so as I'm thinking about the Jewish people in Egypt, to me, that feels like a time when it made sense to turn inward. You would say that was what caused them to then become vulnerable. But I guess I'm just struggling with that, or I'm trying to work through that tension.
I took my kids this week to see the movie David. Did you see it?
No.
Now I hear it's great, though.
It was, I actually spoke about it in Shul this past Shabbos. I loved it.
Yeah.
I loved it. First of all, because it was so well done, but I just felt so deeply moved and proud that this is a story that we've given the world.
Yeah.
And maybe I felt that way because all the pieces aren't in place. We don't have the Beis HaMikdash, and we don't have the luxury of Kivesi Beis Tefillah Yikarei L'Chol Ha'amim, that we just invite everybody in because maybe our foundation isn't as strong. If we think about ways to interact and ways to engage one another, and I just think about these stories that we've given the world, and they've adopted as their own also, don't get me wrong. I just felt so proud to be watching this film and saying, these are our stories.
תמיד על המפה אנחנו נשאר וזה ידוע חיים מתנה הכל צפוי והרשות נתונה